The dust swirled like ghosts across the main street of Bitter Creek, carrying with it the hopes and despair of another drought, stricken day. Jacob Morrison pulled his hat low against the September sun, watching from the porch of his general store as the last customer of the morning disappeared into the shimmering heat. Business had been slow, painfully slow, but not as slow as it had been for most folks in this forgotten corner of Wyoming territory. Jacob had built his store with his own calloused hands 15 years ago, when Bitter Creek still held promise and the railroad was supposed to come through. The railroad never came. Neither did the prosperity that was supposed to follow. What came instead was drought, failed crops, and the slow exodus of families who couldn't hold on any longer. Those who remained did so with a stubborn pride that Jacob both admired and shared, though he sometimes wondered if pride was just another word for foolishness. The bell above his door chimed weakly as he stepped back inside, surveying shelves that were still reasonably well stocked despite the hard times. He'd been careful with his inventory, conservative with credit, and it had kept him afloat when other businesses had shuttered their doors. His wife Martha had always called him practical, sometimes with affection, sometimes with the gentle exasperation of a woman who wished her husband would take more chances. Martha had been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that had swept through town like a prairie fire, and Jacob still found himself making decisions based on what she might have thought. The morning stretched toward noon, with only the sound of the old clock on the wall to mark time's passage. Jacob was reconciling his ledger when he heard the creak of wagon wheels outside, followed by voices. He looked up to see a family approaching his store, and even from inside, he could tell they were in trouble. The wagon was little more than a collection of weathered boards, held together by hope and rust. The single horse pulling it looked as worn as everything else, its ribs showing through a coat that had seen better days. A man climbed down from the driver's seat, his movements careful and deliberate, like someone nursing an injury or exhaustion so deep it had become part of his bones. He was tall but stooped, wearing clothes that had been mended so many times they looked more like patchwork than original fabric. Behind him, a woman remained on the wagon seat, holding what appeared to be a baby wrapped in a thin blanket that had once been white but was now the color of dust and desperation. 2 other children, a boy who might have been 8 and a girl perhaps 6, sat in the wagon bed with their legs dangling over the edge. None of them wore shoes, their feet bare and dusty, speaking of a poverty so complete it had stripped away even the most basic necessities. Jacob had seen plenty of hard luck cases in his years running the store, families who had lost everything to drought, disease, or simple bad fortune. But something about this family struck him differently. Maybe it was the way the man held himself, with dignity despite obvious desperation, or the way the woman's eyes held a fierce protectiveness, even as exhaustion seemed to weigh her down like a heavy coat. The children were quiet in that particular way that spoke of hunger and uncertainty, old beyond their years in the way that children became when they learned too early that the world was not a safe or certain place. The man approached the store slowly, each step deliberate and measured. Through the window, Jacob could see him pause at the bottom of the porch steps, removing his hat to run fingers through hair that was gray before its time, streaked with premature silver that spoke of worries too heavy for any man to carry. When he finally entered, the bell's chime seemed louder than usual in the sudden silence that followed his footsteps across the worn wooden floor. The man stood just inside the doorway for a moment, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. His eyes took in the well-stocked shelves, the jars of candy, the barrels of flour and sugar, the canned goods that represented abundance to someone who had nothing. Jacob saw the man's throat work as he swallowed hard, and recognized the look of a proud man about to ask for help, knowing how it would cost him to do so. "Morning," the man said finally, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone educated, though roughened by years of outdoor work and hardship. There was something in his pronunciation, a careful enunciation that spoke of better days and different circumstances. "Name's Thomas Hartwell. I was wondering if you might have any work that needs doing. I'm handy with repairs, good with horses, and I'm not afraid of hard labor." Jacob looked at the man more closely. Despite the worn clothes and obvious poverty, there was something in Thomas Hartwell's bearing that spoke of a man who had once known better days. His hands, when he removed his hat, were clean despite their calluses, and his speech carried the careful diction of someone who had once moved in different circles, who had perhaps stood before classrooms or sat in parlors discussing literature and politics. "Work's been scarce around here." Jacob replied carefully, studying the man's face. "Most folks are barely hanging on themselves." "What brings you through Bitter Creek?" Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Jacob caught a flash of something in his eyes, pain perhaps, or the memory of better times. "We're heading west, hoping to find opportunities in California. Had some setbacks along the way." He glanced toward the window where his family waited, and Jacob saw the way his expression softened when his eyes found the woman and children. "Truth is, we're in a difficult position. Our supplies ran out 2 days ago, and we've got nothing left to trade." Jacob had heard variations of this story countless times. Families who had lost everything, heading west with nothing but determination and the clothes on their backs, chasing the promise of gold or land or simply a fresh start in a place where their failures wouldn't follow them. Most of the time, he had to turn them away with polite regrets and maybe a biscuit for the children. He couldn't feed every desperate family that passed through, or he'd be out of business within a month. But something held him back from giving his usual response, something in the way Thomas Hartwell stood, proud despite his obvious need. What kind of setbacks? He found himself asking, though he wasn't sure why the question mattered. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his hat as if the words he needed might be written there. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man recounting the collapse of everything he had worked to build. "I was a school teacher back in Kansas. Had a good position in a growing town, a house with a proper library, some savings put aside for the children's future. Then the drought hit, and the crops failed 3 years running. Families started leaving, and the school couldn't afford to keep me on." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "We tried farming for a year, but the land was so dry nothing would grow. Lost the house to debt. Lost most everything else trying to keep food on the table and hope alive." The story was familiar enough in its broad strokes, but there was something in the way Thomas told it, without self, pity or blame, that made Jacob listen more carefully. Here was a man who had lost everything, but still spoke with dignity about his circumstances, who didn't curse fate or blame others for his misfortune. "We've been on the road for 3 weeks now," Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. "Had enough supplies for the journey, or thought we did. We planned carefully, counted every mile, every meal. But the wagon broke down outside of Laramie, and getting it fixed took most of what we had left. Then Sarah took sick." His voice caught slightly when he mentioned his wife's name, and Jacob could see the fear that still lingered in his eyes. "She's better now, thank the Lord, but we had to stop for nearly a week while she recovered, and that used up the rest of our supplies." Jacob glanced out the window again, taking in the scene with new understanding. The woman, Sarah, was attempting to soothe the baby, who had begun to fuss with the thin, persistent cry of hunger that every parent learns to recognize and dread. The other 2 children sat perfectly still, their eyes taking in everything with the watchful wariness of the very young who had learned not to expect good news, who had learned to be grateful for small mercies and to never ask for more than was offered. Something stirred in Jacob's chest, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the way Thomas spoke of his wife with such tenderness, or the sight of those barefoot children sitting so patiently in the hot sun, or simply the recognition of one man's dignity in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Whatever it was, it moved him to act against his better judgment. "I can offer you a day's work," Jacob heard himself say, the words coming out before his practical mind could stop them. "Got some repairs that need doing around back, shelves that could use reorganizing, and the storeroom needs a good cleaning. Won't pay much, but it might buy you some supplies for the road." The relief in Thomas's eyes was immediate and profound, like water in the desert. His shoulders seemed to straighten, and for a moment, Jacob caught a glimpse of the schoolteacher he had once been, the man who had stood before classes and believed in the future. "That's very generous, Mr. Morrison. Jacob Morrison, Mr. Morrison, I promise you'll have no cause to regret this kindness. I'll work hard, and I'll do the job right." "I'm sure you will," Jacob replied, already wondering what Martha would have thought of his decision. She had always accused him of being too soft-hearted for business, though she'd said it with love. "Why don't you bring your family inside where it's cooler? Your wife looks like she could use some rest, and the children shouldn't be sitting in this heat." As Thomas returned to the wagon, Jacob found himself second, guessing the impulse that had moved him to offer help. He'd made it a rule over the years not to get too involved with the desperate families who passed through town. Sympathy was a luxury he couldn't afford, not if he wanted to keep his own business afloat in these hard times. But as he watched Thomas help his wife down from the wagon, saw the careful way he supported her elbow and the gentle words he whispered in her ear, Jacob felt that unfamiliar stirring in his chest again. Sarah Hartwell entered the store like a woman trying to make herself invisible, her movements careful and apologetic. She was younger than Jacob had first thought, probably not yet 30, but hardship had etched lines around her eyes and pulled her cheeks hollow. The baby in her arms couldn't have been more than 6 months old, and despite the heat that made the store feel like an oven, she kept the thin blanket wrapped tightly around the child, as if it were armor against the world's cruelties. "This is my wife, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice carrying a pride that poverty hadn't dimmed. "And our children, William, Mary, and little Joseph." Sarah offered a shy smile that transformed her tired face, revealing traces of the beauty that hardship had worn but not erased. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Jacob Morrison." He found himself returning her smile, struck by the grace she maintained despite her obvious exhaustion. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. There are chairs in the back room if you'd like to rest, and I think I might have some milk that's still cold from this morning's delivery." The children, William and Mary, remained close to their parents, their eyes wide as they took in the abundance of goods surrounding them. Jacob noticed how their gaze lingered on the jars of candy near the counter, the way William's hand moved unconsciously to his stomach when he spotted the crackers and dried meat hanging from hooks near the ceiling. But they didn't ask for anything, didn't even point or whisper. They simply looked, with the careful restraint of children who had learned that wanting and having were two very different things. As Thomas headed outside to begin his work, Jacob found himself alone with Sarah and the children. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled only by the ticking of the old clock and the soft sounds of the baby beginning to fuss again. Sarah rocked little Joseph gently, murmuring soft words, but Jacob could see the worry in her eyes, the way her free hand pressed against her own stomach in an unconscious gesture of hunger. "When did you folks last eat?" he asked quietly, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, the color standing out starkly against her pale skin. "We had some crackers yesterday morning. Thomas caught a fish 2 days ago near a stream outside Laramie, but..." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with admitting the extent of their desperation. Jacob felt something twist in his chest, a combination of sympathy and anger at a world that could reduce a family to such straits. 2 days. These people hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and here they were, too proud to ask outright for help, the man outside working for wages that might buy them a single meal if they were lucky. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said gently, trying to keep his voice casual, "I was just about to fix some lunch for myself. Nothing fancy, just some bread and cheese, maybe some of that milk I mentioned. Would you and the children join me? I'd be grateful for the company." The hunger in her eyes warred with pride, and Jacob could see the internal struggle as clearly as if it were written on her face. These were people who had been self-sufficient, who had provided for themselves and others, and accepting charity went against everything they had once been. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison, but we couldn't impose. You've already been so generous." "It's no imposition at all," Jacob insisted, already moving toward his small kitchen area behind the counter. "Truth is, I don't much like eating alone. Gets lonely in here sometimes." It was the right thing to say. The mention of loneliness, the suggestion that she would be doing him a favor rather than accepting charity, allowed Sarah's resistance to crumble. She nodded gratefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're sure it wouldn't be too much trouble." As Jacob busied himself preparing the simple meal, he found himself really looking at the family for the first time. The children's clothes were clean but patched in multiple places, each repair done with careful stitches that spoke of a mother who took pride in her family's appearance, despite their circumstances. Mary's dress had been let out as much as possible, and William's trousers were clearly too short, showing ankles that were painfully thin. But it was their behavior that struck him most deeply. They sat perfectly still in their chairs, hands folded in their laps, waiting to be invited before touching anything. These were children who had been taught manners, who came from a family that had known better days, and maintained their standards even when those standards became difficult to uphold. When he set the food before them, simple fare of bread, cheese, and cold milk, the children looked to their mother for permission before reaching for anything. Sarah nodded, and they began to eat with careful, measured bites, as if trying to make the food last as long as possible. Jacob pretended to busy himself with other tasks, but he watched from the corner of his eye as the small family shared their first real meal in days. "Mama," Mary whispered after a few minutes, her small hand tugging gently at Sarah's sleeve. Her voice was so soft Jacob almost missed it. "Can I have just one more piece of bread?" The question, asked with such careful politeness, such awareness of scarcity, broke Jacob's heart. But it was Sarah's response that nearly undid him completely. Her face crumpled for just an instant before she composed herself, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and warm. "Of course, darling. Eat as much as you like. Morrison has been very generous." Jacob turned away, pretending to organize some items on his shelves as the family continued their meal. But he could hear every small sound, every whispered thank you, and gentle encouragement from Sarah to her children. When he finally turned back, he saw that Sarah had barely touched her own food, having quietly passed most of her portion to William and Mary when she thought no one was looking. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, approaching the table where they sat. "Please, eat something yourself. There's plenty more where that came from." She shook her head with a tired smile. "I'm fine, truly. The children need it more than I do." It was then that Jacob made a decision that would change everything, not just for the Hartwell family, but for himself. Without saying another word, he walked to his shelves and began pulling down supplies. Bread, dried meat, canned goods, flour, sugar, coffee, milk, and other necessities. Sarah watched in growing confusion and alarm as the pile on his counter grew larger. "Mr. Morrison," she said, rising from her chair with the baby still in her arms. "What are you doing?" "Packing supplies for your journey west," he replied matter-of-factly, continuing to add items to the growing collection. "But we can't pay for all that. Thomas is working today, but what you're gathering there, it would cost more than he could earn in a week." Jacob paused in his selection, looking at the woman who stood before him with such dignity despite her desperate circumstances. "Consider it an advance against future earnings," he said finally. "Your husband strikes me as an honest man, the kind who honors his debts. I'm sure he's good for it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she tried unsuccessfully to blink away. "I don't understand your kindness to strangers, Mr. Morrison. We're nobody to you, just another family passing through with hard luck stories." Jacob was quiet for a moment, thinking of Martha, of the children they had wanted but never had, of the dreams that had died with his wife 3 years ago. "Maybe I see something of myself in your family," he said finally. "Maybe I remember what it was like to need help and hope that someone would offer it." The truth was more complicated than that, but Jacob didn't have words for the complex emotions that had moved him to this act of generosity. All he knew was that helping this family felt right in a way that nothing had felt right since Martha's death. By the time Thomas returned from his work several hours later, sweaty and satisfied with a job well done, Jacob had packed enough supplies to last the family at least a week, maybe more if they were careful. Thomas stopped in the doorway, staring at the packages and bundles that covered nearly every surface of the counter area. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the work you gave me today, but I haven't earned wages enough to pay for all this." "No," Jacob agreed calmly. "But you've earned something more valuable than wages. You've earned trust." Thomas's throat worked as he struggled with emotions too large for words. Jacob could see the man fighting tears, could see the overwhelming gratitude and confusion warring in his expression. "I don't know what to say," Thomas managed finally. "Don't say anything just yet," Jacob replied. "Just promise me you'll write when you get settled in California. Let me know how the family is doing, how little Joseph is growing, whether William and Mary are back in school where they belong." As the Hartwell family prepared to leave, loading the precious supplies into their worn wagon, Jacob found himself reluctant to see them go. In the space of a few hours, his quiet store had been filled with life and purpose in a way it hadn't been since Martha's death. The children had grown comfortable enough to smile and even laugh softly at something their father whispered, and Sarah's exhausted weariness had given way to something approaching hope. "Mr. Morrison," Thomas said as he secured the last of the supplies in the wagon bed. I want you to know that your kindness today has given us more than food and goods. You've given us back our faith that there are still good people in this world, people who care about strangers for no reason other than common humanity. Every person deserves a chance to prove their worth, Jacob replied. You strike me as folks who'll make the most of the opportunity. As the wagon pulled away from the store, Mary turned back to wave, her small hand bright against the dusty landscape. Jacob waved back, standing on his porch until the family disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon, taking with them a piece of his heart he hadn't known was still capable of feeling. The store felt emptier than it had before their arrival, the silence more profound. Jacob tried to return to his ledger, to the routine tasks that had filled his days for the past 3 years, but found himself staring out the window at the empty street. He'd just given away more merchandise than he'd sold in the past month, and his practical mind warned him of the financial consequences. But for the first time since Martha's death, he felt something other than the steady numbness that had characterized his existence, something that might have been purpose. 3 weeks passed before Jacob received the letter he'd been hoping for. The envelope was postmarked from Sacramento, and Thomas's careful handwriting told a story of successful arrival, work found, and a family beginning to heal from their long ordeal. Jacob read the letter 3 times, savoring every detail of their journey's end and new beginning. The letter went on to describe their small house, the kindness of their new neighbors, and little Joseph's remarkable recovery from the malnutrition that had threatened his life. Sarah wanted me to tell you especially about our youngest. Thomas continued. The doctor here says that the good food and milk you provided likely saved his life. He's growing strong now, laughing and reaching for everything within his grasp, as babies should. Enclosed with the letter was a small sum of money, more than Jacob had expected but less than the actual value of the goods he'd provided. It didn't matter. What mattered was the sense of connection, of having made a real difference in lives that desperately needed intervention at a crucial moment. We're sending what we can toward what we owe you. The letter concluded, and there will be more as we become more established. But know that the debt we truly owe you, the debt of gratitude for restoring our faith in human kindness, can never be fully repaid. We will carry your generosity in our hearts always, and we hope that life returns to you the same kindness and grace you have shown to us. Word of Jacob's generosity somehow made its way around Bitter Creek and to other settlements along the territorial roads. Over the following months, he found himself becoming an unofficial stop for families in desperate need. He was careful not to overextend himself financially, but he also found that he could no longer turn away a truly desperate case without at least trying to help in some small way. The changes in his own life were subtle but profound. The store, which had felt like a prison after Martha's death, now felt like something closer to a sanctuary, a place where lives intersected and where small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways he was only beginning to understand. He began keeping a jar of candy near the counter specifically for children whose eyes held too much worry for their age, and he found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't since his wife's passing. A year later, Jacob received another letter from the Hartwells, this one accompanied by a photograph that took his breath away. The family pictured there bore little resemblance to the desperate, hollow-cheeked people who had appeared at his store that September day. Thomas stood tall and proud in a proper suit, his arm around Sarah, who glowed with health and happiness. The children were transformed as well, William and Mary smiling broadly at the camera, and little Joseph, now a toddler, sitting on his father's shoulders with the carefree expression of a child who had never known want. We wanted you to see what your kindness helped create. Thomas wrote, Sarah gave birth to another child 3 months ago, a daughter we named Grace, because your grace saved us when we had nothing left but despair. We're enclosing train tickets. Mr. Morrison, we want you to come visit us in California, to see for yourself the new life that grew from the seeds of compassion you planted in our darkest hour. Jacob stared at the train tickets for a long time, turning them over in his weathered hands. California. A new place, new possibilities, a chance to see the Pacific Ocean and the growing cities he'd heard so much about. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine it, to picture himself in that photograph with the Hartwell family, surrounded by the life and laughter that his intervention had helped preserve. But as tempting as the offer was, Jacob realized that his place was in Bitter Creek, not because he was trapped there by circumstance or obligation, but because he had found his true purpose there. In helping the Hartwell family, he had rediscovered something essential about himself, something that Martha had always seen, but that he had lost sight of in the fog of grief that followed her death. He wrote back to Thomas that evening, declining the visit, but expressing his deep gratitude for the invitation and his joy at seeing how well they had all thrived. "My place is here," he wrote, "helping other families who find themselves in the position you were in that day. You've shown me that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply the chance for someone to prove their worth, to show the world the strength and dignity that poverty can hide but never truly destroy." As the seasons turned and Bitter Creek slowly began to show signs of recovery from the long drought, Jacob's store became known throughout the territory as a place where desperate families could find not just supplies but hope. He never became wealthy from his generosity. Quite the opposite, in fact, but he found something more valuable than money. He found purpose, connection, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using whatever resources you have to lift others up when they most need lifting. Years later, when Jacob had become an old man with a reputation for kindness that stretched across the American West, he would often think back to that September day when Thomas Hartwell had walked into his store with nothing but dignity and desperation. A day that had begun like any other, but had ended with the rediscovery of his own humanity, sparked by a mother's quiet question about whether her children might have just one bite to eat. The Wild West was known for its harsh realities, its unforgiving landscape, and its demand for absolute self-reliance. But it was also a place where ordinary people could become heroes not through acts of violence or dramatic gestures, but through simple human compassion, where small acts of kindness could echo across generations, and where the true measure of a person wasn't found in their wealth or success, but in their willingness to help a stranger in need, especially when that stranger was too proud to ask for help directly. In helping the Hartwell family, Jacob Morrison had not only saved them from starvation and despair, he had saved himself from a life of empty routine and purposeless existence. And in the decades that followed, that moment of grace would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, touching countless lives and proving that even in the hardest places, in the most challenging times, hope could not only survive but flourish when nurtured by human compassion and the simple recognition that we are all, in the end, responsible for each other's well-being. The story of Bitter Creek became, in its small way, the story of the American West itself, not just a tale of individual struggle and survival, but of communities built on mutual aid and the understanding that sometimes the difference between hope and despair, between life and death, could be as simple as someone saying yes when a desperate mother asked if her children could have just one bite to eat.